Professor Hugo Slim, you are welcome to stay here. And now I would like to invite Daniel Kaba, who will be the chair of this next lecture. Hopefully he's with us. Mario, is Dano with us? So we will have to wait few, hey, there he is, Dano. So gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Hello. I wanted to say good morning to all of you, but it's already 3 o'clock, so that wouldn't work. So if we can kindly ask you, after the panel of 3 white mid-age panelists, but I can reassure you that the very next panel after this lecture it's going to be completely female panel. So if you can bear with me, please, and of course, we would for respect if you want to network, which is also why we organize Ambrela Development Forum. Feel free to do that. Otherwise, I would slowly like to ask you to take your seats. Yep, I will be very brief. So, those of you who are interested in why we invited Hugo Slim, Professor Hugo Slim, I will briefly relate to that. I consider Professor Hugo Slim from Oxford one of the, well, if I may say, a few persons that can really, put reflections without being overly destructive and self-destructive to our sector in terms of how we perceive humanitarian aid, the systems, the principles, and also how much things we take somehow automatically for granted, although they might differ, and in the changing world, they are changing as well, right? So, Hugo, I hope that you still have a lot of energy, because Hugo got 3 lectures yesterday at 3 universities in Bratislava, which I'm very thankful for. And just a bit of bits and pieces of Hugo's track record and history. Hugo used to work in the field for about 10 years as a practitioner with Save the Children and with other civil society organizations in different parts of the world. He also worked quite a lot for ICRC, wearing suit and tie. And for a number of years, he, if I may say, made a circle, starting at a young age in theology at Oxford. And now he's back at Oxford for a couple of years, working on humanitarian aid, principal aid, combining also humanitarian aid with his previous large work on ethics, right? And the topic is quite provocative. From humanitarian idealism to realism, right? So, without further ado, I will leave you with Hugo. Afterwards, I might moderate the questions or comments from you. So use Slido, think through, and we got almost an hour to go. So enjoy, and Hugo, please come over.
Daniel, thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to Ambrela. It's a lovely event. I've really enjoyed it so far, and it's very nice to be in Slovakia. It's actually very nice for me to be in Central and Eastern Europe, because visiting Central and Eastern Europe has come late in my life. I've not really known it before, so it's been a real pleasure to meet such lovely people in Slovakia. Such great energy and such warm hearts. So thank you for welcoming me here. And it's such an important time for us to be meeting and for us to be thinking together as Europeans and as humanitarians. And there's probably 4 reasons why it's such an important time. First of all, we are at the beginning of another geopolitical shift, a geopolitical change. We're also coming to terms with a financial crash in humanitarian aid. And we're also beginning to see the real challenge of climate change. The beginning of what I call the Earth emergency is now really coming towards us. And, of course, it's exciting because we have a new generation, as always, in our species, we have a new generation of humanitarians. And I spent 3 sessions at 3 different universities in Bratislava yesterday, and really encouraged by the intelligence, the thoughtfulness, the commitment and seriousness of this new generation. So I was thinking as I was putting this talk together, I was thinking, in fact, this geopolitical change now is my 5th geopolitical change, because I'm quite old. So it's my 5th geopolitical age. So when I started, I joined Save the Children in 1983. And this was the Cold War. It was one of the high points of the Cold War. So I started my work in that geopolitics of the clash between capitalism and communism. And then, of course, that moment ended and changed, and then we had this period of liberal, basically unipolar world where for a period of time people agreed with the liberal American European consensus, and we had agreement around the table at the UN Security Council, and people felt they could act unanimously in the world. And then, of course, that changed a little in 2001, and we had the beginning of a sort of global Islamist revolution and the global war on terror against that, which then dominated another important period. And then also at that time, we began to see the rise of China, which became very exciting, and there was a feeling that this was going to consolidate a sort of consensual liberal capitalist world. And then, of course, we've moved into the next phase, which is really the collapse of that idea, and realizing, in fact, that there is huge competition now in a multipolar world of disputing different great areas of power. So China, the US, Russia, India, Latin America, and Africa. And we see ourselves now in a multipolar world. And now with war again, so close to us here in Europe as well, changing and really showing the truth of this new geopolitical age. So today I will try and do 3 little things. I'm going to, in a sense, tell you the story, remind us of the story of humanitarianism from 1992 to 2022, which for me is the age of humanitarian utopianism, when my generation really thought, right, we can create humanitarianism for the whole world. And that utopian 30-year period. And of course, I'm then going to suggest that that era is finished, and we're now in a much more conservative political realism that is dominating our thinking now, and a big change in attitude towards internationalism, humanitarianism. And so thirdly, I'm going to try and begin to think, so what is the new humanitarian realism after the age of humanitarian utopianism? So let me try and, while people are doing a class on storytelling next door, let me tell you how I see the story of the humanitarian utopianism of 1992 to 2022. And of course, in some ways, we can mark it with the end of the Cold War, and because we're Europeans, I hope, as a British person, I hope I can still say I'm a European, as we can mark it with 1992, which was the creation of EU ECHO and its first year in existence. So, in that year, global humanitarian aid was probably about $1, $2, $3, $4 billion, maybe $5 billion then. And of course, it then rose in the boom period to 2022, where it peaked at about $48 billion. So that's the utopian period. These 30 years of an idealistic vision of worldwide humanitarian aid for everyone, everywhere, in disaster and war. And it came to the peak, in a way, of that ambition in 2022, 2023, when humanitarians said, we are going to help 300 million people this year around the world. And that ambition was really all about creating a global safety net, almost a global welfare system for people suffering in war and disaster. And I just want to, in a sense, remind us of how we did that, because in a way we invented it all during that period. And at the heart of that invention was a very Western, liberal, passionate concern for the human individual. So the whole of this utopian vision was built around saving, assisting, protecting the individual. Let me identify 6 aspects of that attempt to create this utopia. And the first is principles, which we still hear about today. But you know, when I started, I really started in humanitarian work in Ethiopia and Sudan in 1985 for Save the Children, we didn't have humanitarian principles. I'd never heard of the principles of humanity, impartiality. I'd never heard of them. I'd never heard of the Geneva Conventions, and I was working in a war at that time. So what happened in the early 90s is that we reached into the Red Cross movement and we took their principles of humanity, impartiality, and neutrality particularly, and we raised them and said, these are the principles for the whole world. And we had those principles taken up at the United Nations, embodied into our international NGOs where they had not been before. We changed the names in British, in English, and American from emergency to humanitarian, and everyone changed their plaques on their doors from emergency director or relief director to humanitarian director. And we copied the Red Cross globally. The UN did it, and states began to do it. ECHO did it, and took these principles in-house. Many parliaments in the West took them into their legislation, and the United Nations General Assembly took them into their resolutions, and the United Nations Security Council did the same. So that was the first big thing, and of course we know those principles by heart: humanity, impartiality, neutrality. That was the beginning of the moral invention into international politics and international relations. And then we also said we must recover international law, which makes these things real as well. So we all learnt the Geneva Conventions, and we owned the Geneva Conventions. And we did the same with refugee law, and we did the same with human rights law. And we wrote a humanitarian charter at this time to say that these things were what we expected governments to do as part of this humanitarian system worldwide. And therefore, people had a right to humanitarian aid and to right to assistance. And we then went further, and we put that humanitarian charter at the front of these new standards we designed, which were called the Sphere Standards. And humanitarians, to an incredible degree, went around and saying, right, well, if we take people's right to humanitarian aid seriously, what is that right? Quantify it. And so we said food, water, health, shelter, and we said every person will have, well, I can't remember what it is now, 3, 4, 5 liters of water a day. Every person in a shelter will have so many square meters. Nobody will be more than 50, 100 meters from a toilet or a latrine when they are suffering. And human rights lawyers were amazed. They had never seen human rights detailed to such a degree. But humanitarian utopianism said, yeah, we're going to do this. And these are our standards. And we had code of conduct as well, and all these things. The next thing we did, of course, because as you do this, we ended up creating big, transnational, humanitarian bureaucracies. When I joined Save the Children in 1983, our office, our global headquarters, was an old girls' school in Camberwell in London. And we had a budget of 17 million pounds for the world. And it was mostly from ordinary people. But then the government said, right, we are going to join you in this utopian humanitarian project. And they piled money in. And we all grew, and we all, with our Red Cross principles, began to imitate big United Nations agencies and big transnational bureaucracies. And then the fifth thing we did during this 30-year period, we began to elaborate what constitutes humanitarian aid. And so we had food, water, shelter, and health, but then we said, right, but it's more than that, because if you look at how people suffer in a war or disaster, if you listen to them, you hear that their needs are much bigger than that, and we need to help the whole human being. And so we added education. And ECHO was a key role in adding education as a humanitarian need. People need to keep going to school in war and disaster. And then we said, but you know, bodily harm and bodily health is bad, but what about mental health and emotional health? What about people, what they're feeling in war and they're feeling in disaster? We have to engage with feelings as well as humanitarians. And we said, but we've got to think about safety. So we invented a whole field of practice called protection, where we really thought that we would be able to protect people everywhere, and that was what governments and armed groups and soldiers and everyone should be protecting people. And huge protection departments opened all over international NGOs and UN agencies. So we elaborated the field of humanitarian practice and humanitarian aid. And really, if you look at it, what we were really focusing on is what a friend of mine from Save the Children called, we were trying to do micro-saving. We were trying to micro-save every person in need, physically, human rights, mentally, economically. We were trying to micro-save 200, 300 million individuals per year. And we really thought at this time, with the rise of China and India's growing middle class and Africa's middle class, we really thought, this is a great system we're inventing, and it could be a global system. And I think these things we called new donors or emerging donors, we thought, they'll join us and they'll start paying as well, so we'll double, triple the system, and it really will be a global welfare program. But of course they didn't. And this was the beginning of the problem, because they thought this is a really particular Western system of humanitarian aid. And China looked at it and said, I'm not going to go and join this very individualized system of human rights-based humanitarian aid. Also, I don't want to join a system where I'll be a second-class citizen in the system because I didn't invent it and I came late. And Russia obviously felt the same, and India has always hated international aid, so they stayed away. Brazil thought a bit, but didn't really commit. The people who did join the West were the Gulf-rich Arabs, and they're still here, largely because they had so many wars in their own region that they wanted to throw humanitarian money at it, but also because their big Islamic global system of aid was sort of similar, so they had lots of money and could support the Western system too. So we elaborated this sort of utopian vision and this very elaborate practice, developing humanitarian aid almost like a welfare state that we would do in our own countries. And we got bigger and bigger. But other people didn't join in, and then people began to pull away from the system in the West as well. So gradually we saw my government, the British government, reduce its 0.7 commitment. And then we had extraordinary governments following. The Swiss began to cut. The Germans cut. The Dutch cut. Everybody began to cut. And then, of course, in February this year, the Americans didn't just cut, they stopped overnight everything, and we had our humanitarian crash. So in a way, that's how I understand this last 30 years of what we've been doing. And we are left in our policy, in our theory of practice, in our ambition, with this very elaborate utopian vision of micro-saving individual humans all around the world. But we're not in that position now. And this year, we've had to completely think again. So what does it mean now for humanitarianism to be in a period of the return of political realism after utopianism? And certainly if we look at 2025 compared to 1992, they're very, very different. So 2025 is not like 1992. Politics, geopolitics, this is not a utopian moment. It's completely the opposite. And if the 1990s were idealistic, hopeful, open, liberal, universal, and international, 2025 is realistic, fearful, closed, conservative, authoritarian, nationalist. And if the 1990s were all about the individual, this wonderful focus on the human person, each human person, 2025, the political, geopolitical focus is not on the sovereignty of the individual, which was talked about in the 1990s. It is about the state. And 2025 is about the survival of the state, not the flourishing of the individual. And it's about the survival and importance of national interests, not individual rights. And it is about collective identities, not individual, human, diverse persons. So in a way, if we're thinking philosophically, the 1990s, where I started and all of us tried to invent this utopian system, was really guided by the philosophers from Europe like Kant, Immanuel Kant, and the great German-American, and the British liberal individualist, John Mill. But if we look at 2025, the people I'm hearing in my ear when I listen to conservative, right-wing people, the Republicans in America and the right-wing people in my own country and across Europe, I'm hearing Friedrich Nietzsche despising the weakness of the slave morality and urging an aristocratic, noble, courageous kind of manhood, standing on its own feet, not focusing on weakness. And I'm also hearing the great American realist Henry Morgenthau, talking about state politics. There will always be conflict, thinking of national interest, preparing yourself to be in the best position as a state. And the other thing today is that humanitarianism has no great patron. For 30 years, we had these amazing patrons, America and Europe. We still have Europe, but we don't really have a really big geopolitical patron anymore. So, why did this happen? Why has all this happened, and why does it seem to happen so quickly? I think, in truth, Western priorities have changed very, very quickly, but we could see it coming. The West has turned inwards now, when it was turning outwards in the 90s. And when I was younger, the challenge was always apathy. People would give aid, but they were a bit apathetic. You had to mobilize them. The problem now of getting attention for humanitarian aid and internationalism has moved from apathy to animosity. People actually have animosity towards aid and animosity towards the idea that we need to help people who are poorer and weaker and suffering around the world. And that's a different challenge. And why did this happen? This happened first, I think, because migration, as it grew and grew and grew, or seemed to grow as it arrived in Europe much more, it moved from being a problem of compassion and sympathy to becoming a threat. And people were living, after the crash of 2008 and after COVID, with lower growth and inflation and their own cost of living crisis across Europe. And then, of course, in 2022, we have the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine and the realization of the reality of Russian aggression, extremely destructive in Europe again. And so defense priorities shot up, and as a result, aid priorities went down. There was also climate change has become much, much more realistic to Western countries themselves, with floods and heat waves and droughts becoming really obvious in Europe itself, so that we are the ones with a problem, as well as people over there. And then aid skepticism, and some of it legitimate aid skepticism from the left about aid is colonialism, and from the right saying, we've been helping South Sudan for 30 years. What's the point? The big men go on fighting, we pay for their welfare system. What's the point? People should stand on their own feet, and if a state wants self-determination, they should determine themselves, not fight between each other while we pay the welfare bill. So there was right and left criticisms delegitimizing aid itself. And if our period of the 90s into the utopian period was all about norming, we were inventing and creating new international norms, from humanitarian principles to sphere standards to the International Criminal Court. We were creating international norms. This is a period of de-norming and probably re-norming. So we're going to be lucky to make new things because people are going to open up the Refugee Convention and change it. They're probably going to open up the European Convention for Human Rights and change it. This is a period of de-norming and re-norming, and it's very, very different. And it's also, as I've heard several times in rooms today and in conversations, it's also a time of delegitimizing civil society. And that's a big challenge as well. Not a new one, because we had it when I was younger. We have it again. You've had it here with communism. So it's just happening again. So these things are important. And this is the spirit of the age in which we live now. And the great, great French diplomat, probably the greatest diplomat of all times, really, Talleyrand from France, who had this extraordinary career of surviving as foreign minister in so many different global shifts. He started in the French monarchy, then he moved and he ended up working as a foreign minister to the revolution. Then he twisted again and became Napoleon's foreign minister in the Republic and then in the Empire. And then when Napoleon collapsed, he managed to become foreign minister in the new monarchy. So he had this extraordinary survival career. And he always said, you cannot work against the spirit of the age. You can always have your policy, and ours is to be humanitarian and reduce suffering and protect human beings. You have that policy, but you have to do it within the spirit of the age. And that was his mantra, and I think it has to be ours. So what is humanitarian realism in the 2020s? And I don't really know, but I'm going to offer some, I hope, realistic thoughts. And the first one is economically, humanitarian economics. Humanitarianism, international humanitarianism, is going to be much smaller. And already, Tom Fletcher in his reset is saying, we're not doing the 300 million, that's been crossed out. We're going to try and do 100 million people. Still this focus on individual micro-saving, if you like. And of course, we also know that if we're going to have less, we've got to do more with less. So we probably won't be able to do so much micro-saving of individual human beings, this focus on people in need. We may have to change our unit of analysis and say we can't save loads and loads of individual people. We can save systems on which they depend. So maybe we'll have to focus on getting multiplier effects by prioritizing water systems, health systems, economic systems, ecological systems. And we may have to invest more in these big systems and multipliers and ask ourselves each year, how many systems have we saved so that people can save themselves with those systems? It may be a different approach. And of course, we're going to have much smaller humanitarian bureaucracies. And that's happening now, as many of you sadly know. We're going to have to find ways of having different organizations, more like startups, more like investment companies, where we have far fewer people who usually end up just talking to each other anyway, in my Red Cross experience, and a few good people doing stuff. And we're going to have to change the culture of the way we work and be much smarter and smaller. Politically around us, it's clear to me that increasingly humanitarian thinking will be Europe first. We're going to be thinking about our own floods, our own risk of warfare and hybrid warfare, our own heat waves. We're going to be thinking about our national preparedness. And we've heard several times today, and I would urge you as well, play your part in national preparedness. Play your part with government as an auxiliary to government or as a partner to government to prepare your own countries for climate disaster, possible hybrid warfare, and even warfare. So work at home as well. And then we are also going to make choices. Internationally, you can't work everywhere. You're going to have to decide where you want to work, and you're going to have to you can't have a universalist ambition. You're going to have to qualify your universalism and say, we largely work abroad in our area, or we have one or two countries we're particularly close to where we work, or we work with allies in areas that really need us. And one thing that also happened politically to humanitarianism is that we'll see much more patriotic humanitarianism. People will say humanitarianism is a patriotic thing. It's not a neutral thing. We have to do it to save ourselves, our societies, and our allies. And there will be much more patriotic and perhaps less neutral humanitarianism. And then the third big thing that's really different from the 1990s now in 2020s is during that period we recognized the earth is suffering too. And we cannot have a fetishistic obsession with the human individual. We have to think of the earth, and we have to think of nature too. So the big thing we have to really change, where we have to really innovate now, because it's so realistic, is to create an ecological humanitarianism, which takes the life of nature as importantly as the life of humans, because there is no human life without other life. And human survival is always a joint project between humanity and nature. And every time you and your organizations try and save a human life, you do it by plugging that human life back into nature, to water, to crops and food, to clean air, to shelter materials. We survive because of nature and with nature. And in the 2020s and 2030s, we've got to crash nature organizations together with humanitarian organizations. The Worldwide Fund for Nature with the International Red Cross. They've got to work across landscapes and think, what does this landscape need? Not do what all these people need. What does this landscape, all life, nature, and people in this landscape need to survive? That's a huge change we have to make. The health people are ahead of us because they're thinking of planetary health and One Health, but we all need to have a new nature-based humanitarianism. Socially, the last thing I would say is I think, realistically, we cannot work any longer with big, expensive humanitarian organizations. In the 1990s, we all admired the model of the global corporation, and we created global humanitarian corporations. No, we've got to change that. We now have to see humanitarianism as a social movement in every country and across the world. So our model should be social movements today. And listening to Martina and Veronica today, this is going to be very important, that we keep social movements alive, legitimate, well-funded. And that means re-inspiring individuals not to pay into a corporation, but to be part of social movements where they're volunteers, they're giving money, they're giving time, and they own those organizations locally. So that means seeing whole society humanitarianism, not just in Europe, but in African countries and Asian countries, everywhere. Whole society humanitarianism, where churches, schools, Red Cross organizations, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, everybody is mobilized to be a humanitarian for the climate emergency and for possible war. And diplomatically, finally, we need to keep humanity alive in multilateral politics. So we need to have a humanitarian movement across the world and be able to talk about humanitarian priorities at the UN, at the EU, and we need to really concentrate on keeping it alive in multilateral politics. And the EU in particular needs to keep alive the fact that humanitarianism within EU countries, within EU states, should be a social movement. The treaties, the EU treaties, recognize the participation of citizens, the participation of civil society, the participation of religious institutions across Europe as central to European culture, law, and politics. And we have to make sure that recognition continues. So I'll stop there and hope that was useful in some ways as a story and as what we might expect.
Hugo, thank you so much. I think that you managed to, attract so much attention. We got 6, 7 questions over there in Slido, but we would also like to give space to you a bit more vividly in the audience. So let's take first, someone of you. We got a mic over there with our volunteers. So is there any hand? Somebody, of course, who didn't put the question into the Slido. Is there any question? Okay, if not, we still have 10 minutes, so okay, there's Floris waving. Please, Floris, try to be short, please. Brief.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That ate into my time. Thank you. Hugo, just quickly, when you talk about this new move of, or a new way of looking at things, at landscapes, at people in landscapes, nature, and so on and so forth, does that mean that we, in your opinion, need to give up the idea of individual, what do you call it, micro-saving?
Thank you, Floris. It's difficult. I think we're going to have to compromise a bit on micro-saving, and we're going to have to say, look, people, and it's been said today, people know how to look after themselves, people know how to look after their neighbors. We shouldn't step in and try and take so much control for running mental health in an area, or organizing mental health, or income, or whatever in an area. We're going to have to say to people, look, we're a social movement, we've all got to look after each other in some way. And so I think we, as agencies, we won't have the money to take care in such detail, and we'll be needing everyone to do that. So it's almost about creating a humanitarian culture again, so that in emergencies we all know how to look after each other. It's a bit like disaster preparedness. Children know to do this, adults know to do that. Have you got this ready? In a sense, I think realistically, of course we must never lose focus on the preciousness of every individual human life. And we should each want to check on each other and make sure we're all right in that respect. But we won't be able to go into the detail across great volumes of populations, I doubt, as our own agencies.
Good, thank you. Couple of rows behind, right? Do I see correctly? Do you have a mic? Over there. Sorry, Honza.
I have Mike, and I have a question. Thank you for the excellent lectures. As usual, in your future humanitarian world, as you envision it, what would be the role of the UN? And can you please explain them what is their role? Thank you.
So I hope the UN survives. The UN is so important. It must survive, and I hope it will, because we'll only have to reinvent it. And it's a really important organization. But it will be smaller too. And a lot of it will depend on the next Secretary General. Because I think a key part of the UN emphasis will need to be peace again. And that's peace between humans and peace with nature. And I think if we can get a real, I was so disappointed with the UN 80 reform, because all they did is, we'll stay exactly the same, but we'll merge and get cost effectiveness and cost cutting across what our mandates are. But actually, we need states to change the mandate so that, peace between humans and peace between humans and nature and ecological focus becomes a UN priority as well. Whether that will happen, I don't know, but I think the UN will be smaller, and it will have to prove to a new generation of more conservative, authoritarian rulers that it's useful, relevant, and has important global norms. And they will shape it. We'll see what happens with politics, but...
I don't want to overlook any other questions, so there's another one. Yes, please, Alan.
You didn't mention the private sector. What do you see as the role of business in this humanitarian future?
Thank you. So I meant to mention the private sector. I call it business. I don't like the phrase private sector. When I was in business for 4 years, and nobody used that phrase about themselves. They said, I'm in business. That's what I do. So I think, business is really important. It's usually business that creates products and salaries and jobs that keeps everybody alive, or the majority of people alive. And we will need business to really thrive. And hearing one of the speakers just now talking about the importance of green jobs, I think that's a real challenge. We've got to get green jobs happening all over the world as well as we make the energy transition. But businesses can be extraordinarily humanitarian too. I mean, businesses are key. If you're doing cash distributions for people who are struggling and suffering, unless there are businesses there making, buying, selling things that those people need, they can't survive. So business is crucial in itself as business for keeping products and materials available, but it's also important because it can be incredibly humanitarian at certain times by donation, by supporting, by paying its employees when they can't work because of various things. So it has a humanitarian role and a vital economic role, obviously.
Thank you, Hugo. Let's give a space to two more. I see 3 hands, okay. Maybe one by one. Ivo Kaplan. And Ivo, please try to be brief.
Yeah, I will try. Thank you. Thank you for the floor. Mr. Professor, I have maybe 2 principal questions. The first is the monetary system. That means if you think that US dollar could be a ground for the next period, or it must be to change this system, where is the GBP, USD, euro, and Japanese yen. So I think that it should be changed and make some neutral benchmark in the currency. And the second is the Security Council, because I think there is a charter of the United Nations, and there is written if one of the permanent members have the regional conflict, he should resign, or he should have no votes in that period by the end of the regional. So practically we are in a situation where we are out of following the charter of the United Nations. So my questions are inspired by your last sentences about the necessity of the UN reform.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to disappoint you. I don't know enough about finance, but it depends what happens between America and China. But I do think it's a large possibility that we will see a sort of decoupling. And I think the renminbi, I think we'll get a big renminbi area. And I think China would like that a lot more people are effectively using the renminbi as their reserve currency rather than the dollar. And I think that I don't know, that may well begin to happen in the next few years. So that's a possibility. On the United Nations, you reminded me of that article or paragraph. I can't remember it, actually, so I'll go and check it if it's in the charter. It's in the charter. Yeah. Okay, so obviously that's never been done, before. I'm not aware that anyone's stepped out of the ring before. And very often with international law, power, geopolitics can trump it in a sense, and we'll see what happens. But it's an important point.
Thank you. Let's try last 2 questions over there, and then Kaito in the front, okay?
Thanks, Daniel. Philip Pertucker, European Disability Forum. Hugo, thank you for that great lecture. I feel like I got a masterclass, so thank you. I'm 25 years a human rights activist and watching humanitarian aid from the sidelines. And I see a big difference between human rights work and humanitarian aid in terms of policy, process, implementation, impact, and the way that the movements work. I see 2 different types of movements. So my question to you would be, what is in your thinking, which I really enjoy, do you think that with the rise of human rights and individuals succeeding in demanding their rights, whether it's persons with disabilities or sex workers or drug users or LGBTIQ community, do you think with the rise of that, the need for humanitarian aid is changing or maybe diminishing? Somehow, what is the connection in your thinking?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely idea. I would hope so. Funnily enough, I didn't talk about it this time, but of course, in the 19th century, 18th century, 19th century in Europe, and the early 20th century, everybody called themselves humanitarians. So if you were anti-slavery, trying to abolish the slave trade, you were a humanitarian and you called yourself a humanitarian. If you were doing factory reform in the Industrial Revolution and trying to reduce working hours and create safe conditions for workers in cotton factories or coal mines, you called yourself a humanitarian. If you were arguing and creating schools for girls so that women got access to education, you called yourself a humanitarian. Now, what really happened from World War I, World War II onwards is that, and then really big time in our time, the word humanitarian shrank right down to be associated with war relief and disaster relief. And all those other areas were swept up as human rights and development. And this big new post-World War II concept of development took a lot of those issues, and then so did human rights. So the word humanitarian got left with this very small bit, which was war relief and disaster relief. And really the Red Cross then colonized the word and said it applies to disaster relief and war. Whereas most people were saying, oh, well, I thought I was a humanitarian because I've been doing factory reform and labor rights. And oh, okay. So I think you're right that actually we talk about a lot of things that are deeply important to us as Europeans. We talk about them as human rights, like disability, like all the other rights you mentioned. And we have to, as the gentleman in the front row, I don't know his name.
Ivo Kaplan.
Ivo, as you said earlier, you know, we have to keep struggling for those rights. Democracy doesn't just stay. You said this today. We have to keep working for it. So I'm not saying that, you know, well, we must give up on human rights. You know, we're going to have this new realistic period. One of the sliders said dystopian, and that upsets me. I don't want to be dystopian. As a European, I'm going to go on fighting for individual human rights and for democracy. But we won't be able to do as much around the world as we used to, and we probably won't be able to do it in that much detail. And we will be busy here.
Thank you, Hugo. Kaito, can we get to the gentleman in the second row, the mic? Kaito, please, you're the last one, so try to be brief as well.
I'll try.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the reflections. When I'm just on that dystopia thing, I can see why dystopian would come up, especially when putting all of these ideas together. And so if we're talking about a humanitarian sector that is smaller, that is less bureaucratic, one that is more patriotic, nationally minded, focusing on systems instead of individuals, it almost sounds like it has nothing in common with the humanitarian sector that you see today. And if humanitarianism becomes a movement, movements are often not centrally coordinated, right? They come from values, they come from shared beliefs and feelings. Do you potentially see a future where the humanitarian sector is not a sector at all, that it doesn't exist? The UN does peace, national governments do relief, and people themselves do what they can to help each other?
I don't know. I think the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement will stay central and important, and I really hope it will. And one of the reasons it will is because it's an auxiliary to every government. So it must play that role. And one of the things I'm encouraging the British Red Cross to do today is remember you're an auxiliary. You've got to start working with the government to prepare for big emergencies in the UK and not do all your effort overseas. So I think there will be humanitarian institutions and humanitarian organizations, but there will be much less money. And civic energy, a lot of civic energy, I think, will not go into growing bigger bureaucracies again, but will go into locally led, community-orientated, church-based, school-based, business-based, as ways of climate resilience and response. And if we have hybrid warfare and things, we're all going to have to, help each other and find more organized ways. So I think that the institutional bit will be smaller. And I hope the social movement bit will be bigger.
Good. Hugo, thank you very much. So, Lou.